The streets of New York in the 1920s were alive with both opportunity and danger, a city pulsing with the raw energy of immigrants chasing the American dream while navigating the shadows of corruption, poverty, and organized violence. Horse-drawn carriages clattered alongside automobiles, and the air was thick with smoke from factories and speakeasies alike. In neighborhoods like the Lower East Side and East Harlem, life was a constant negotiation between survival and ambition, where every choice could be a step toward fortune or a slide into peril. For many, the law was a distant, almost mythical force, often ignored, bent, or corrupted by those with power and influence. Police precincts were underpaid and overworked, and politics had been intertwined with organized crime for decades, creating a fragile, chaotic equilibrium. Into this world, where desperation met cunning, emerged a figure who would not merely navigate the system but seek to transform it entirely: Charles Lucky Luciano. Luciano's story begins not with wealth or inherited power, but with the grit and determination of a streetwise immigrant boy, whose intelligence and ambition outstripped his modest surroundings. He was not the loudest, the most violent, or the most feared, yet he possessed an innate understanding of human nature, an ability to read people, and a calculating mind that would one day allow him to command an empire. In the chaos of New York's criminal underworld, he saw patterns where others saw only violence and unpredictability. He recognized that brute force alone could only achieve so much, and that survival, and eventually dominance, required strategy, alliances, and a ruthless sense of timing. This was also a time when America itself was undergoing seismic shifts. Prohibition had transformed everyday citizens into criminals overnight, creating a booming black market for alcohol that fueled immense wealth for those daring and clever enough to exploit it. The streets were alive with gang activity, with every corner and alley a potential battleground for control. Italian, Jewish, Irish, and other immigrant gangs fought for territory, influence, and survival, their loyalties often shifting as quickly as the wind. Violence was commonplace, but so was ingenuity. The criminal underworld had its own economy, its own rules, and its own code, a world that seemed alien to outsiders but utterly familiar to those born into it. In this landscape, Luciano's genius was both subtle and transformative. While others relied on intimidation and brute force, he sought to bring order to chaos, to create a structure that mirrored legitimate business yet operated entirely in the shadows. He understood the power of fear, respect, and loyalty, and he learned early that alliances could be more valuable than weapons, and foresight more potent than strength. His rise would not be immediate. It would be shaped by small victories, careful observation, and a willingness to bend moral codes in the pursuit of power. Yet even in his earliest days on the streets, there were hints of a mind capable of seeing far beyond the immediate struggle for survival. The city itself seemed to conspire with ambition. Its crowded tenements, bustling ports, and underground speakeasies provided endless opportunity for someone willing to navigate the thin line between legality and crime. For Luciano, the street was both classroom and battlefield, where lessons were harsh, stakes were life and death, and victories were hard-won. It was here, in these crowded, smoky, dangerous streets of New York, that the foundations for what would become the modern American Mafia were quietly being laid, not through brute violence alone, but through vision, intellect, and an unparalleled understanding of power. By the time Luciano began to assert himself, New York was ripe for transformation. The old guard of chaotic gangsters, who ruled through fear and sporadic violence, was still powerful but increasingly ineffective in a world that demanded coordination, strategy, and business acumen. Prohibition had expanded the stakes exponentially, and with it, the opportunity for a criminal mind to rise above the rest. Luciano's emergence was not merely the story of one man's ambition. It was the story of a city on the edge of transformation, of a criminal world that would never be the same again, and of a mind capable of orchestrating a revolution in organized crime. In these opening chapters of the American Mafia, the seeds of power, strategy, and fear were being sown, and Luciano was quietly planting them with precision. Before Lucky Luciano's rise, the criminal underworld of New York City was a fractured, violent landscape, ruled by brute strength, personal grudges, and shifting alliances. Gangs were organized less like businesses and more like tribes, bound by family ties, ethnic loyalty, and a brutal code of retaliation. Italian, Jewish, and Irish gangs dominated the streets, each controlling neighborhoods, extorting businesses, and running illegal rackets, yet none had the vision or cohesion to unify the sprawling criminal ecosystem. It was a world defined by chaos, where loyalty could be bought with fear, and betrayal was a constant threat. Violence was both currency and message. and survival often meant choosing between becoming a pawn in someone else's war or taking up arms to carve out your own territory. The old gang leaders were emblematic of this chaotic system. Men like Joe Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano ruled through intimidation and tradition, enforcing their will through violence rather than strategy. Their authority was immediate, tangible, and terrifying, yet fragile, because it relied entirely on personal power and loyalty that could fracture under pressure. Disputes over territory, profits, or honor often escalated into bloody wars, leaving neighborhoods scarred with vendettas and the occasional public execution. In these conditions, even a small misstep could cost a life, and ambition was as likely to get a man killed as it was to propel him forward. The underworld before Luciano was also deeply fragmented along ethnic lines. Italian gangs were themselves divided between Sicilians, Neapolitans, and Calabrians, each fiercely protective of their traditions and influence. Jewish and Irish gangs operated in parallel, running their own bootlegging, gambling, and extortion operations, rarely coordinating beyond temporary truces. While alliances existed, they were fragile and often dissolved as quickly as they formed. Unlike legitimate businesses, which thrive on trust, communication, and systemic organization, the gangs of this era relied on intimidation, unpredictability, and violence as tools of negotiation. Money flowed freely, but it was unstable, and long-term planning was nearly impossible because every day brought new threats from rivals, law enforcement, or even one's own associates. Into this unstable world came Lucky Luciano, whose vision contrasted sharply with the prevailing methods of the time. Where Masuria and Maranzano relied on fear and tradition to maintain control, Luciano saw opportunity in structure, negotiation, and long-term strategy. He understood that the underworld could be transformed from a chaotic collection of street gangs into a coordinated network, capable of maximizing profits while minimizing unnecessary risk. His approach was revolutionary. He would harness violence strategically, use alliances to solidify power, and treat criminal enterprises as a business to be managed rather than a battlefield to be survived. Yet, understanding the chaos was only half the battle. Luciano had to navigate a deeply entrenched hierarchy, where respect for elders and tradition was paramount. Breaking the mold required not only intellect but also patience, charm, and the ability to conceal ambition until the right moment. He observed the old ways carefully, learned from the mistakes of predecessors, and waited for openings that could be exploited. Every street, every speakeasy, and every backroom meeting became a classroom, offering lessons in human behavior, negotiation, and manipulation. In these early years, Luciano developed the psychological acuity that would allow him to predict his rivals' moves, anticipate betrayals, and exploit weaknesses before anyone else could react. The consequences of failure in this era were immediate and brutal. The city's criminal landscape was littered with examples of ambitious men who had overreached, shot in the street, beaten into submission, or betrayed by those closest to them. Each violent episode sent ripples through the community, serving as both warning and lesson for others. The stakes were existential. In the criminal world, survival was not guaranteed, and even the smallest miscalculation could result in death. This reality shaped Luciano's mindset, fostering a combination of caution, calculation, and relentless ambition that set him apart from his peers. Despite the dangers, the era also presented immense opportunity. Prohibition had turned everyday vices into massive black market industries, creating untapped wealth for those capable of organizing supply chains, enforcement, and distribution. Speakeasies, illegal breweries, and gambling dens thrived, and control over these operations promised both power and influence. Yet, the fragmented structure of the gangs meant that most of this wealth was siphoned off through inefficiency, infighting, and mismanagement. For someone with vision, this inefficiency was an invitation, a chance to consolidate power, organize operations, and become indispensable to the criminal ecosystem. By the time Luciano began making his moves, the underworld was a powder keg, ready for someone with both courage and intellect to impose a new order. The old ways of chaotic, short-term thinking were giving way to the possibility of strategic, long-term dominance. The fragmented gangs of the city, while violent and unpredictable, were also predictable in their patterns of behavior. Luciano's genius lay in his ability to see beyond immediate conflicts, understanding that controlling the criminal economy required more than muscle. It required negotiation, alliances, and the creation of a system that would outlast any single leader. The world before Luciano was one of survival, fear, and reactive decision-making. Every corner could hide a rival, every meeting could end in a bullet, and every alliance could collapse without warning. Yet, within this chaos, opportunities existed for the shrewd and patient, for those who could perceive patterns where others saw only disorder. Luciano's entry into this world was not marked by immediate dominance, but by observation, calculation, and subtle influence. He began as one among many, but his vision, ambition, and intellect allowed him to see a future where the fragmented underworld could be unified, controlled, and monetized in a way no one had imagined before. In this context, Luciano's rise was not merely a personal story, it was a story of transformation. He would take a violent, chaotic, and fragmented criminal world and impose a structure that elevated strategy above brute force, negotiation above retaliation, and long-term planning above impulsive violence. Before he could do so, he had to understand the world he sought to control, learn its unspoken rules, and navigate its treacherous networks of loyalty and betrayal. The state of organized crime before Luciano was a fractured battlefield, and in its midst, a mind capable of both seeing and shaping the future quietly began to assert itself. Luciano's story truly begins in the crowded, teeming streets of Sicily, a land both beautiful and unforgiving, where family, honor, and survival intertwined in every aspect of daily life. Born in 1897 in Lercora, a small mining town marked by poverty and social tension, he was immediately immersed in a culture where ambition was necessary, cunning was rewarded, and weakness could be fatal. The young Charles, later known as Lucky, absorbed lessons in resilience and strategy from the very start. Sicily, at the turn of the century, was not just a backdrop, it was a formative crucible, a place where the realities of injustice, corruption, and survival shaped the minds of those destined to navigate the margins of society. From a young age, Luciano was exposed to both hardship and the subtle lessons of power. His family, while loving, struggled to make ends meet, and young Charles learned early that life demanded both shrewdness and initiative. He witnessed firsthand the ways in which social structures favored the cunning and punished the naive, lessons that would later inform his calculated approach to power. Even in this rural setting, the values of hierarchy, loyalty, and negotiation were omnipresent. Family ties were paramount, but so too were the unspoken codes of the community, lessons in influence, intimidation, and careful observation that would prove invaluable in his later life. The move to New York City in 1906 marked the beginning of a new chapter, one in which the raw chaos of urban life would collide with the ambition of a young immigrant boy. The Lower East Side was a labyrinth of tenements, narrow alleyways, and crowded streets, alive with the noise and vibrancy of immigrant communities seeking survival and opportunity. Italian immigrants, like the Lucianos, lived in cramped apartments, often with multiple families sharing a single space. The streets were filled with pushcarts, factories, and children running freely amid the perilous mix of commerce and poverty. It was here that the young Luciano learned the first rules of urban survival: adaptability, street smarts, and the necessity of reading people in moments of both threat and opportunity. School offered little escape from the harsh realities of daily life. Luciano was reportedly clever but restless, often drawn more to the streets than the classroom. The streets became his education in human behavior, negotiation, and observation. He quickly learned to navigate both allies and rivals, recognizing that strength was not only physical but psychological. Survival depended on reading moods, predicting actions, and knowing when to act and when to wait. In the chaos of immigrant New York, the seeds of his strategic mind were taking root, as he observed how the ambitious, the ruthless, and the cunning could thrive even in the most unforgiving conditions. The social networks of the Lower East Side also introduced Luciano to a diverse array of personalities and ethnic groups, shaping his understanding of alliance and negotiation. Italian gangs were dominant, but Jewish and Irish groups maintained significant influence, and intergang interactions often necessitated both diplomacy and subtle intimidation. Luciano's early friendships and rivalries exposed him to the intricate dance of loyalty and betrayal, providing a practical education in the psychology of power. He learned that respect could be as persuasive as violence, that alliances were valuable only as long as they were profitable, and that a careful observer could exploit the weaknesses of both friends and enemies alike. By his teenage years, Luciano had already begun to dabble in petty crime, testing the limits of his cunning and learning the consequences of miscalculation. Pickpocketing, gambling, and small-time theft were not mere rebellion, they were practical lessons in risk, reward, and human psychology. Each small success reinforced the value of strategy, patience, and observation, while every setback taught the dangers of impulsiveness. It was during this period that Luciano began to see the potential for ambition beyond survival. He realized that the streets, with all their danger, were also a marketplace for influence, negotiation, and eventually dominance. Luciano's early mentors and influencers were equally critical in shaping his trajectory. Older gang members, seasoned in the brutal arts of extortion, enforcement and clandestine operations, provided him with examples of both skill and folly. Some embodied the dangers of recklessness, serving as warnings, while others demonstrated the power of foresight, calculation and controlled aggression. Luciano absorbed these lessons not through formal apprenticeship, but through careful observation and trial, developing a mind capable of analyzing both immediate threats and long-term opportunities. His intelligence, charm and adaptability allowed him to navigate a world where brute force was common, but strategy rare. The neighborhoods themselves were a theater of education. Every corner, alley and storefront offered lessons in human behavior. He learned to recognize the subtle signs of fear, ambition and deception in the people around him. He noted who wielded power through violence, who through respect and who through subtle manipulation. Luciano's ability to perceive these nuances marked him early as different. Someone who did not merely react to events but anticipated them, who did not simply fight for survival but calculated the paths to advantage. It was an early demonstration of the psychological mastery that would later define his rise. Family life, too, played a subtle role in shaping his ambition. The pressure to succeed, to elevate himself beyond the limitations imposed by poverty and ethnicity, instilled both a drive and a sense of urgency. Yet he balanced this with an understanding of loyalty, obligation and social currency, a delicate psychological balancing act. Luciano learned to weigh choices not only in terms of immediate gain but also in long-term relationships and reputational impact, a skill that would become essential in navigating the treacherous waters of organized crime. By the time he reached adulthood, Luciano had transformed from a streetwise immigrant boy into a young man with both ambition and vision. The chaotic streets of New York had become his classroom, the people around him his teachers, and every encounter a lesson in strategy and influence. His intelligence, charm and calculating nature allowed him to move through the underworld with subtlety, observing the old guard and envisioning a new kind of power, one that relied not solely on violence, but on organization, negotiation and strategic manipulation. In these early years, the foundations of Luciano's character were set. The combination of Sicilian heritage, immigrant struggle, street education, and exposure to both danger and opportunity forged a psychological resilience and intellectual acuity that would define his approach to crime. He was not merely a survivor of the Lower East Side, he was a thinker, a strategist, and an observer of human nature. The boy who had navigated the tenements, alleyways, and gangs of New York was quietly preparing to reshape the criminal world, to take the chaotic fragments of the city's underworld and mold them into a cohesive, organized empire. By the time Luciano entered his late teens, the streets of New York had become both his playground and his battleground. Survival alone was no longer sufficient. Ambition demanded action, and in the unforgiving world of the Lower East Side, action often meant stepping into the shadowy realms of crime. Luciano's first encounters with the underworld were not dramatic headlines but small, calculated moves that allowed him to test his instincts, assert influence, and understand the delicate balance between power and danger. Every alleyway and storefront offered lessons in both opportunity and risk, and he approached each with the meticulous observation that would later define his leadership style. His earliest ventures into crime were typical for streetwise youth of his environment: petty theft, pickpocketing, and running small errands for older gang members. These were not merely youthful indiscretions, they were practical lessons in risk assessment, human behavior, and the mechanisms of influence. Luciano learned to gauge a mark's fear, hesitation, or greed, exploiting weaknesses while carefully avoiding unnecessary exposure. Each small success built confidence, and each misstep offered hard-earned lessons in humility and caution. It was in these early, unglamorous acts that Luciano began cultivating the skill set that would make him a master manipulator. Observation, timing, persuasion, and the occasional calculated act of intimidation. Luciano quickly realized that crime was as much about relationships as it was about action. Alliances, even temporary ones, could provide protection, access to resources, and opportunities for advancement. He learned to navigate the delicate web of loyalties and rivalries that defined the local gangs. By observing how older members of the underworld operated, how they negotiated territories, enforced rules, and managed both fear and respect, Luciano absorbed the intricacies of power. He saw the pitfalls of impulsiveness, witnessing the downfall of peers who acted rashly or misjudged their rivals, and he internalized the necessity of careful planning, patience, and discretion. During this period, Luciano also began to develop a reputation for intelligence and audacity. While many of his peers relied purely on brute force, he combined observation with strategic thinking. He was neither the most physically imposing nor the most violent, but he possessed a sharp mind capable of understanding complex social dynamics and predicting behavior. This allowed him to maneuver in ways that others could not, negotiating minor disputes, identifying vulnerabilities in rivals, and capitalizing on opportunities before others recognized them. His ability to blend subtlety with decisive action made him both respected and feared, even in these early stages. The environment itself was a crucible for Luciano's development. Speakeasies, gambling dens, and illicit markets were thriving hubs of both commerce and conflict. Operating within these spaces required more than courage. It demanded intuition, negotiation skills, and psychological acuity. Luciano quickly understood that money could buy influence, but influence could buy even more power than money alone. He observed the transactional nature of fear, respect, and loyalty, learning to manipulate perceptions to his advantage. Each small criminal enterprise, each interaction with a rival or ally, became a laboratory for testing strategy, refining tactics, and understanding human motivations. One of the defining aspects of Luciano's early criminal activity was his understanding of escalation. He did not seek immediate domination. He pursued incremental influence, carefully selecting which risks were worth taking and which battles could be postponed or avoided entirely. This approach set him apart from peers who relied solely on violence to assert authority. Where others acted impulsively and often paid the price in blood, Luciano measured the consequences, calculated gains and losses, and cultivated patience, a rare quality in a world defined by immediacy and retribution. Luciano also began to recognize the limitations of small-time operations. While petty theft and minor rackets provided experience and some income, he saw that true power came from scale, organization, and the ability to control resources, people, and networks. This realization planted the seeds for his later efforts to centralize and professionalize the underworld. Even in these formative years, he imagined a system where efficiency, coordination, and strategic alliances could transform chaos into an empire. His early experiences with small crimes were not ends in themselves but stepping stones toward a larger vision. In addition to street education, Luciano's early criminal activity honed his psychological resilience. The Lower East Side was unforgiving, and mistakes were punished harshly, by rivals, by police, or by circumstance. Luciano learned to navigate threats calmly, assess danger without panic, and make decisions under pressure. These lessons were invaluable, shaping a temperament that balanced caution with decisiveness, and fearlessness with prudence. He was developing the mindset of a leader, someone who could inspire loyalty while maintaining control, even in high-stakes situations. As Luciano's reputation grew, so did his network of contacts and opportunities. Older gang members took notice of his cleverness, and some began to rely on him for minor tasks, testing his abilities and judgment. These small endorsements were critical, providing access to more significant operations, resources, and influence. Each success reinforced his strategy of blending intelligence with subtle force, building trust with allies while maintaining the capacity to outmaneuver rivals. In this way, Luciano's early criminal ventures were not merely about survival. They were about establishing credibility, demonstrating value, and positioning himself for future dominance. By the end of this phase of his life, Luciano had transformed from a streetwise youth into a capable and ambitious operator in the criminal underworld. He had learned that survival required more than toughness, that influence depended on perception as much as action, and that strategic thinking could outperform raw violence. These lessons would serve as the foundation for his rise, informing his later approach to alliances, power consolidation, and empire building. The small-time crimes of his youth were the laboratory in which he honed the skills that would ultimately allow him to reshape organized crime in America. Luciano's first steps in crime were deceptively modest, yet they contained the seeds of a master strategist. Every theft, every negotiation, every observation of human behavior added to his arsenal of knowledge, preparing him for the challenges that lay ahead. By combining intelligence, patience, and psychological insight, he distinguished himself from peers who relied solely on muscle, positioning himself as someone capable of both navigating and ultimately controlling the chaotic world of the New York underworld. These formative experiences set the stage for a trajectory that would see Luciano rise from a street-level operator to the architect of modern organized crime, demonstrating that ambition, intellect, and subtlety could triumph over brute force alone. As Luciano moved beyond the streets and small-time crime, he began to understand that raw ambition alone was insufficient in a world governed by alliances, influence and the delicate balance of fear and respect. The streets had taught him the value of observation and caution, but to rise he would need to master the art of relationship, learning not only whom to trust but when and how to leverage those connections to build power. The underworld of New York was not just a collection of criminals. It was a web of interdependent actors, each with their own ambitions, grudges, and calculations. Success required the ability to navigate this network, to find common cause with potential allies, and to exploit divisions among rivals. Luciano's first significant alliances were forged with older, more experienced mobsters who recognized both his intelligence and his audacity. He aligned himself carefully, never rushing, understanding that premature moves could be fatal. He observed the inner workings of established gangs, noting how leaders consolidated control, managed disputes, and balanced loyalty with fear. From these interactions he learned lessons in negotiation, strategic patience, and psychological manipulation, skills that would later allow him to outmaneuver his contemporaries and redefine the structure of organized crime. A crucial aspect of these alliances was mutual benefit. Luciano understood that power in the underworld was rarely about domination through brute force alone. It was about making oneself indispensable. By providing services, solving disputes, or facilitating profitable ventures, he became a valuable asset to those higher up in the hierarchy. Allies came to rely on him for his foresight, intelligence, and reliability, which gradually increased his influence. The ability to build trust while retaining independence allowed Luciano to navigate treacherous waters with minimal exposure to unnecessary risk, a delicate balancing act that few of his peers could achieve. Equally important was Luciano's understanding of timing. He observed the aggressive, impulsive behavior of some gang leaders and realized that patience could be a weapon in itself. By waiting for the right moment, he could strike alliances when they were most advantageous, undermine rivals subtly, and position himself as a central figure in conflicts he had carefully orchestrated from the sidelines. Timing, in Luciano's eyes, was as potent as bullets or intimidation, and it became a cornerstone of his emerging strategy. Every move was calculated, every relationship leveraged for maximum effect, and every potential threat neutralized with foresight rather than force alone. Luciano also began cultivating relationships beyond his immediate ethnic community, understanding that the fragmented structure of New York's criminal world presented opportunities for cross-cultural alliances. He reached out to Jewish and Irish mobsters, forming temporary partnerships based on shared profit and mutual protection. These alliances were inherently precarious, as old loyalties and prejudices ran deep, but Luciano's skill in negotiation and his reputation for reliability allowed him to bridge cultural divides in a way few others could. This strategic inclusivity would later prove essential in building the multi-ethnic coalition that formed the backbone of the modern mafia. Mentorship played a critical role in Luciano's development. Older gang leaders, recognizing his talent, provided guidance in exchange for loyalty and results. From these mentors he learned not only operational tactics but also the subtleties of psychological influence, the ways in which fear, respect, and persuasion could be wielded to control men without resorting to unnecessary violence. He saw firsthand how alliances could be manipulated, how loyalty could be earned and extracted, and how ambition could be masked beneath a veneer of obedience. Luciano internalized these lessons, combining them with his natural intellect to become a master strategist, capable of navigating complex networks of power with ease. Betrayal and deception were also part of the education. Luciano observed allies turning on one another, partners scheming for greater profit, and leaders eliminating threats in subtle and overt ways. These experiences sharpened his awareness, teaching him to read motivations, anticipate treachery, and plan contingencies. He realized that in the underworld, loyalty was transactional, trust was conditional, and power required constant vigilance. Each alliance was both an opportunity and a risk, a potential stepping stone to dominance or a trap leading to ruin. Understanding this duality became one of Luciano's defining strengths. During this period, Luciano also developed an understanding of the psychological dynamics of leadership. He noted that fear could command obedience, but respect commanded loyalty. While many gang leaders relied solely on intimidation, Luciano recognized the power of combining both elements judiciously. By rewarding loyalty, punishing betrayal, and maintaining an aura of competence and reliability, he could inspire a following that was both disciplined and motivated. This approach contrasted sharply with the erratic, often violent methods of his contemporaries and allowed him to establish a level of control that would later underpin his empire. The art of negotiation became a critical skill. Luciano learned to mediate disputes between rival factions, using diplomacy as a tool to maintain peace when necessary and manipulate outcomes to his advantage. By positioning himself as a central figure in conflict resolution, he increased his influence and visibility, establishing a reputation for strategic acumen. Allies and rivals alike began to see him as a man capable of orchestrating outcomes rather than merely reacting to events, a psychological shift that elevated him above mere gangsters and positioned him as a visionary leader. Financial acumen was another aspect of these alliances. Luciano quickly recognized that control of lucrative operations, gambling, bootlegging, and labor rackets, required careful coordination among multiple parties. He began to structure partnerships and agreements that maximized profit while minimizing risk, creating systems of accountability and influence. By integrating strategy, alliances, and operational oversight, Luciano demonstrated a level of organizational skill that set him apart from the chaotic, short-term thinking of his peers. By the end of this formative period, Luciano had become a man whose influence extended far beyond his immediate circle. His careful cultivation of alliances, mastery of negotiation, and understanding of psychological dynamics allowed him to move through the criminal underworld with an authority and subtlety unmatched by his contemporaries. He had learned to balance ambition with patience, loyalty with self-interest, and opportunity with risk, creating a foundation for the empire he would later build. Luciano's genius during these years lay in his ability to see the underworld not as a series of isolated conflicts but as an interconnected system of relationships, rivalries, and resources. By mastering alliances, understanding the intricacies of loyalty and betrayal, and applying psychological insight, he positioned himself as both indispensable and strategically untouchable. These lessons in power, observation, and influence were not abstract. They were lived experiences honed through trial, error, and careful calculation. They would become the blueprint for the modern organized crime structure, transforming Luciano from a streetwise operator into a master architect of the American Mafia. Luciano's rise from an ambitious street operator to a dominant figure in New York's underworld was neither abrupt nor accidental. It was a calculated ascent built on intelligence, strategy, and an uncanny ability to exploit opportunity. By the mid-1920s, he had already distinguished himself as a man who could navigate both the chaos of the streets and the intricate politics of organized crime. Unlike many of his contemporaries who relied on sheer violence to assert dominance, Luciano combined observation, psychological acuity, and timing to consolidate influence and expand his reach. The path to becoming a Don required both patience and audacity, and Luciano embodied both qualities in equal measure. The consolidation of power began with strategic strikes against rival factions. Luciano understood that to climb higher, he could not merely survive the existing hierarchy, he had to reshape it. He orchestrated carefully planned hits, sometimes subtle and other times violent, ensuring that the outcomes served both immediate goals and long-term positioning. He leveraged the weaknesses of older, established leaders, exploiting divisions, grievances, and alliances to his advantage. In each move, he calculated the impact not only on his immediate gain but also on his reputation, influence, and future negotiating power. Every victory elevated him, not just in territory or money but in status, an intangible yet vital currency in the underworld. A key factor in Luciano's ascent was his ability to balance fear and respect. Many mobsters relied solely on fear to command obedience, leaving them vulnerable to betrayal and instability. Luciano, by contrast, cultivated respect alongside intimidation. Those who worked with him, or under him, understood that loyalty brought reward, that competence was recognized, and that betrayal carried consequences. This dual approach created a disciplined, motivated network that was both reliable and self-reinforcing. His reputation as a leader who combined ruthlessness with intelligence began to precede him, attracting allies who recognized his vision and deterring rivals who feared both his capability and his reach. The organizational genius of Luciano became evident as he began to formalize alliances, creating a structure that allowed for coordinated operations across multiple gangs and neighborhoods. He recognized that fragmentation and inefficiency were the underworld's greatest vulnerabilities. By negotiating truces, consolidating resources, and establishing chains of communication, he transformed disparate factions into a cohesive, cooperative system. This was revolutionary. While others operated in a state of constant infighting, Luciano orchestrated networks that functioned with precision, allocating territories, dividing profits, and coordinating operations with a level of sophistication previously unseen. Crucially, Luciano's rise was not solely dependent on eliminating rivals. it also relied on strategic partnerships. He aligned himself with influential figures across ethnic and geographic boundaries, forging alliances that maximized profit and minimized conflict. These relationships were carefully curated, often temporary, yet mutually beneficial, providing Luciano with access to resources, intelligence, and manpower. He understood the power of coalition building, recognizing that influence could be multiplied through cooperative ventures. These alliances, while sometimes fragile, were maintained through a combination of personal charisma, calculated reciprocity, and subtle intimidation, a skill set that would become the hallmark of his leadership. As his influence expanded, Luciano began to implement a vision of the underworld as a business rather than a battlefield. He sought to professionalize operations, reduce unnecessary violence, and maximize profitability. Where earlier mobsters fought endlessly over minor slights or territorial disputes, Luciano emphasized efficiency and strategic focus. Violence was a tool, not a pastime; it was to be deployed with precision and purpose. This approach allowed him to consolidate power more effectively than those who relied solely on brute force, elevating him above traditional gang leaders and positioning him as a true architect of the modern mafia. Psychologically, Luciano displayed a remarkable capacity for manipulation and foresight. He could read allies and rivals alike, anticipating moves, detecting weaknesses, and exploiting them without direct confrontation. He maintained an aura of calm control, masking ambition beneath the appearance of measured action. This combination of perception, patience, and subtle coercion allowed him to neutralize threats before they materialized fully. By the late 1920s, Luciano's network had grown to encompass multiple key operations across New York, and his influence was felt in every corner of the city's underworld. One of the most defining moments in his ascent was his orchestration of the eventual elimination of the old guard. Men like Joe Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano, who had relied on tradition and fear to maintain power, underestimated Luciano's strategic mind. He played both sides in their conflicts, manipulating rivalries and arranging alliances that positioned him advantageously. When the time came, these older leaders were removed, Masuria in a carefully orchestrated hit, Maranzano shortly thereafter, leaving Luciano as the uncontested central figure. This was not merely a violent triumph. It was a masterclass in psychological strategy, patience, and coalition building, demonstrating that his ascent was as much about intellect and manipulation as it was about action. With the old guard gone, Luciano moved quickly to institutionalize his power. He created the Commission, a governing body designed to mediate disputes, allocate territories, and enforce rules across the mafia network. This structure transformed organized crime from a chaotic collection of gangs into a disciplined, coordinated enterprise. The Commission allowed Luciano to maintain control without needing to be physically present in every conflict, creating a system where influence and authority were codified, not dependent solely on personal violence. This innovation solidified his position as a don not only of New York but as a central figure in the emerging national network of organized crime. At the same time, Luciano maintained direct oversight of key operations. Gambling, bootlegging, and labor rackets were organized with attention to detail and efficiency. He ensured that revenues flowed predictably, disputes were resolved according to clear rules, and loyalty was rewarded. Through careful management, he transformed criminal operations into profitable enterprises, balancing risk and reward while minimizing exposure to law enforcement. This combination of strategic vision and operational competence distinguished him from all predecessors, establishing a new model of leadership within organized crime. Despite the growing power, Luciano remained acutely aware of the precarious nature of authority. The underworld was volatile and alliances were fragile. He continued to monitor rivals closely, cultivate loyalty, and position himself for contingencies, understanding that power required constant vigilance. His leadership style combined foresight, adaptability, and psychological insight, allowing him to respond effectively to both internal and external challenges. By the end of this phase, Luciano had not only risen above his contemporaries but had also redefined the very nature of power in the American criminal world. In sum, Luciano's rise to become a don was the product of a rare combination of intelligence, psychological insight, patience, and audacity. He moved deliberately, exploiting opportunities while minimizing risk, building alliances while neutralizing threats, and transforming chaotic street gangs into a disciplined, profitable, and coordinated network. His ascent demonstrated that true power in the underworld was not merely about violence or fear but about vision, strategy, and the ability to orchestrate complex human dynamics. By the early 1930s, Luciano was no longer simply a rising figure. He was the architect of modern organized crime, a man whose methods and influence would shape the mafia for decades to come. Luciano's true genius lay not merely in accumulating power but in reshaping the very architecture of organized crime, transforming it from a chaotic patchwork of rival gangs into a coordinated, disciplined network capable of unprecedented efficiency and profitability. Where his predecessors relied on brute force, personal loyalty, and sporadic violence to maintain control, Luciano saw an opportunity to create a system, a structured empire that could endure beyond the lifespan of any single leader. This vision was revolutionary. It was the birth of modern organized crime, a methodical, almost corporate approach to an illegal world built on fear, respect, and calculated ambition. At the heart of this transformation was the creation of the Commission, a governing body designed to arbitrate disputes, allocate territories, and codify rules across the mafia network. Before Luciano, conflicts over territory or profit often resulted in bloody wars that destabilized entire neighborhoods. With the Commission, these disputes could be managed through negotiation and mutual interest, reducing unnecessary violence while simultaneously solidifying Luciano's influence. It was a system that treated criminal operations as organized enterprises rather than chaotic skirmishes, ensuring that power was maintained not just through fear, but through cooperation, predictability, and the strategic management of relationships. Luciano's vision extended far beyond the bounds of New York. He understood that the underworld was not a series of isolated gangs but a network of interconnected operations spanning multiple cities and ethnic groups. He fostered alliances with influential figures across Italian, Jewish, and even Irish communities, creating a coalition capable of coordinating nationwide bootlegging, gambling, and extortion operations. These partnerships were delicate, requiring both negotiation and psychological insight. Luciano knew that loyalty could not simply be demanded. It had to be earned and continuously reinforced through mutual benefit, strategic favors, and the subtle application of influence. By integrating diverse groups into a single framework, he expanded his reach and created a template for a national criminal network. The corporatization of crime under Luciano also involved the rationalization of operations. He analyzed every enterprise, gambling, bootlegging, labor rackets, and prostitution, seeking efficiency, reliability, and predictability. Risk was managed meticulously. Territories were divided, operations streamlined, and revenue flows monitored. Violence was no longer a constant pastime but a carefully deployed tool, used strategically to maintain control or eliminate threats. By emphasizing organization over impulsive aggression, Luciano reduced the instability that had plagued his predecessors while increasing profitability. His approach combined the cold efficiency of a businessman with the ruthless pragmatism of a gangster, a duality that allowed him to dominate a world still largely ruled by fear and chaos. Psychologically, Luciano's strategy relied as much on perception as on action. He cultivated an image of both competence and inevitability, projecting a presence that demanded respect and subtly intimidated rivals. Leaders and foot soldiers alike recognized that he possessed a vision far beyond immediate gains, one that accounted for alliances, contingencies, and long-term positioning. This awareness created a psychological dependency. Allies deferred to him not only because of his power but because of his foresight, trusting that his decisions would maximize their collective advantage. Fear, respect, and strategic brilliance became intertwined, reinforcing his authority without the need for constant violent enforcement. The structuring of operations also included the deliberate decentralization of authority. While Luciano maintained overall control, he delegated operational responsibilities to trusted lieutenants who oversaw specific territories or enterprises. This created a balance. He could exert influence across a vast network without micromanaging every detail, while his subordinates felt empowered yet accountable. The result was a resilient and adaptable system, capable of withstanding internal disputes, law enforcement pressure, and the unpredictability of rival factions. Luciano had effectively transformed the mafia from a collection of volatile personalities into a functioning enterprise, with rules, hierarchy, and accountability. Central to this system was the professionalization of criminal roles. Whereas earlier gangsters often combined enforcement with day-to-day management haphazardly, Luciano introduced a division of labor. Hitmen, enforcers, financiers, and administrators each had defined responsibilities, allowing the network to operate with precision. Profit was maximized and unnecessary risks minimized. By institutionalizing these roles, he created a level of efficiency and predictability previously unseen in the underworld. The psychological impact was profound. Members of the network understood that competence, loyalty, and reliability were rewarded, while recklessness and betrayal carried predictable consequences. This alignment of incentive and authority strengthened cohesion and enhanced operational effectiveness. Luciano also recognized the value of public perception and subtle influence beyond the underworld. Bribery of law enforcement officials, political figures, and labor leaders ensured a level of protection and influence that insulated operations from interference. By manipulating both visible and invisible levers of power, he extended his reach beyond the immediate criminal community. The interplay of legal, political, and criminal dynamics became another tool in his arsenal, allowing him to shape environments in which his operations could thrive. In this sense, his empire was not only organized internally but strategically integrated with the structures of society itself. Perhaps most striking was Luciano's ability to balance innovation with tradition. He respected the existing codes of the mafia, such as loyalty and secrecy, but he was willing to bend or reinterpret them when they conflicted with efficiency or expansion. He modernized the underworld without dismantling its core identity, creating a synthesis of old-world loyalty and new-world organization. This balance allowed him to command both respect and obedience, blending the psychological weight of tradition with the strategic advantage of innovation. In doing so, Luciano created a criminal model that could endure across generations, adaptable yet anchored in shared codes and values. The birth of modern organized crime under Luciano was also a psychological triumph. By centralizing authority, establishing rules, and coordinating operations across ethnic and geographic boundaries, he instilled a sense of predictability in a world long defined by chaos. Members of the network knew their roles, understood the consequences of disloyalty, and were incentivized to perform efficiently. Rivals recognized that challenging his authority required not only courage but meticulous calculation. Through structure, negotiation, and strategic use of both fear and respect, Luciano had created a system that amplified his influence while minimizing exposure, a masterstroke of psychological and organizational insight. By the end of this transformation, Luciano's empire was both formidable and sustainable. He had taken a fragmented, violent, and chaotic underworld and imposed a logic, structure, and hierarchy that allowed it to function like a corporate network. Violence was no longer the default. Strategy guided decisions. Alliances were not temporary conveniences. They were instruments of coordinated power. Profit was no longer incidental. It was the objective around which the network revolved. In reshaping organized crime, Luciano not only solidified his dominance but also set a template that would influence criminal operations worldwide for decades. The genius of this period lay in Luciano's ability to combine strategy, psychology, and operational innovation. He understood that true power did not reside in physical strength alone, but in the orchestration of people, resources, and information. By creating a disciplined, adaptable, and multi-ethnic network, he transformed crime from chaotic survival into organized enterprise. The birth of modern organized crime was not merely a historical milestone. It was a psychological revolution, a demonstration of how intellect, foresight, and strategic coordination could triumph over chaos and fear. Luciano's masterstroke was complete, and the underworld of America would never be the same. As Luciano's power grew, he quickly realized that the strength of his empire would not be determined solely by money, territory, or manpower. It would be defined by loyalty, trust, and the unspoken rules that govern the underworld. Central to this was the ancient code of the Mafia, omerta, a moral and psychological framework that demanded silence, obedience, and absolute discretion. Breaking the code could mean death, but adherence was more than a matter of survival. It was a mechanism of cohesion, a bond that held an otherwise volatile network together. For Luciano, mastering the dynamics of loyalty and betrayal became as important as any business deal or strategic alliance. Omerta was not simply a rule, it was a psychological contract. Members were bound by honor and fear, yet the lines were often blurred, and interpretation could be manipulated by the clever and ambitious. Luciano understood that loyalty could not be demanded. It had to be earned, cultivated, and continuously reinforced. Through strategic rewards, subtle persuasion, and selective displays of power, he shaped a network that felt both disciplined and voluntary. Allies were incentivized to remain loyal because doing so brought opportunity, protection, and recognition, while betrayal carried swift and inevitable consequences. In this system, obedience was both rational and instinctive, a profound psychological tool that amplified Luciano's authority. The interplay between loyalty and betrayal was delicate. Luciano's network was composed of men with their own ambitions, grudges and rivalries. He observed carefully, learning to read subtle signs of wavering allegiance. A hesitation in speech, a diverted glance, or a sudden shift in behavior could signal potential betrayal. By anticipating these moments, he often neutralized threats before they materialized, using a combination of negotiation, strategic intimidation, and, when necessary, violence. This constant psychological vigilance became a hallmark of his leadership, allowing him to maintain stability in an environment defined by unpredictability. At the same time, Luciano recognized the value of selective leniency. Not every mistake or act of defiance required punishment. Sometimes measured forgiveness reinforced loyalty and respect. By differentiating between minor lapses and deliberate betrayal, he created a nuanced system in which allies understood both boundaries and expectations. This strategic subtlety strengthened bonds and fostered a sense of psychological security within his organization. Members knew that while loyalty was paramount, competence and usefulness could temper judgment, creating a culture where individuals were motivated to serve the collective while simultaneously seeking personal gain. Betrayal, when it did occur, had to be dealt with decisively. Luciano understood that indecision or inconsistency would undermine the credibility of his authority. Acts of treachery were met with swift consequences, serving as both punishment and deterrent. These actions were calculated to send a clear message. Loyalty was not optional, and the code of omerta was absolute. However, Luciano applied this principle strategically, ensuring that displays of force were as much about psychological impact as they were about eliminating threats. The fear generated was tempered by respect, creating a network that was disciplined yet motivated, compliant yet ambitious. The psychological dimension of omerta extended beyond the individual to the collective. Luciano cultivated a culture in which loyalty was internalized, not simply imposed. Through rituals, shared codes, and a sense of shared purpose, members came to see themselves as part of a system larger than themselves. This sense of belonging enhanced cohesion, minimized internal conflict, and reinforced the network's stability. For Luciano, the code was both a tool of control and a means of creating organizational identity, a framework in which personal ambition could coexist with collective objectives, provided that boundaries were respected. Luciano's skill in managing loyalty and betrayal also extended to the manipulation of perception. He understood that rumors, appearances, and strategic gestures could shape behavior as effectively as any action. By projecting an image of omniscience, decisiveness, and fairness, he influenced how allies and rivals assessed risk, loyalty, and opportunity. Members were encouraged to act in alignment with the organization's interests, often without explicit instruction, because the psychological pressure of reputation and expectation guided their decisions. In this way, Luciano's mastery of human psychology became an invisible yet powerful force within the network. The tension between fear and respect was never static. It had to be constantly managed. Too much fear could lead to rebellion or covert sabotage, while too much leniency could invite challenges. Luciano walked this line with precision, calibrating displays of power, negotiation, and reward to maintain equilibrium. Loyalty became both incentive and safeguard, while betrayal, though inevitable in some cases, was systematically controlled to prevent destabilization. This delicate balance allowed the network to operate efficiently, reducing internal conflict while maximizing the loyalty and productivity of its members. Luciano also understood that loyalty could be influenced by personal opportunity. He created a system in which individuals could achieve personal success while contributing to the collective enterprise. This alignment of personal and organizational interests strengthened bonds and reduced the temptation to betray, as members recognized that their advancement was directly tied to the stability and profitability of the organization. By blending self-interest with shared purpose, Luciano engineered a form of psychological cohesion that was both pragmatic and profound. In addition to managing internal loyalty, Luciano leveraged omerta as a defensive mechanism against external threats. Law enforcement, politicians, and rival gangs were all subject to the protective power of silence and discipline. The code created a barrier, insulating operations from scrutiny and maintaining strategic advantage. Luciano's understanding of these dynamics allowed him to operate with a level of security and control unmatched by his predecessors, further cementing his authority and influence. By mastering the psychological complexities of loyalty and betrayal, Luciano transformed the Mafia into a disciplined, resilient, and strategically coherent organization. The Code of Omerta was not merely tradition. It was an instrument of governance, shaping behavior, reinforcing hierarchy, and ensuring that power remained both centralized and durable. Loyalty became a currency, betrayal a calculated risk, and the interplay between the two a defining characteristic of the modern criminal enterprise. In this environment, Luciano's genius was evident not only in his ability to wield power but in his capacity to understand and manipulate the human mind. He recognized that fear could compel obedience, respect could inspire devotion, and strategic incentives could align personal ambition with collective objectives. Through careful observation, psychological insight, and calculated action, he created a system in which loyalty was maximized, betrayal minimized, and the organization's stability ensured. By the end of this period, Luciano had cemented his reputation as a master of human dynamics. He had learned to balance reward and punishment, perception and reality, personal ambition and organizational necessity. Loyalty was no longer a fragile, reactive element, it had become the structural foundation of his empire. Betrayal was inevitable, but it was contained, anticipated, and neutralized with precision. Through this delicate interplay, Luciano established a level of control and resilience that would define his dominance for decades and ensure that his vision of organized crime endured beyond the chaos of his era. By the early 1930s, Luciano's vision of organized crime had matured into a sophisticated enterprise that combined strategy, psychology, and ruthless efficiency. At the heart of his power lay the business of crime itself, the complex network of illegal operations that generated wealth, influence, and leverage. Unlike earlier mobsters who often approached criminal activity as a series of independent ventures or personal conquests, Luciano treated these operations as coordinated, profit-driven enterprises. Every illegal trade, every racketeering scheme, and every enforcement action was integrated into a system designed to maximize efficiency, minimize risk, and reinforce authority. Bootlegging during Prohibition represented one of Luciano's most lucrative ventures. He recognized the immense demand for alcohol and the opportunity to control supply chains through organized coordination. Unlike fragmented gangs that competed violently over territory, Luciano created partnerships that ensured smooth distribution, reduced conflict, and maximized revenue. Speakeasies, suppliers, and distributors were all managed within a framework that balanced accountability with discretion. Through these operations, he demonstrated a level of operational sophistication that mirrored legitimate business practices, albeit executed in the shadows of the law. Gambling was another cornerstone of Luciano's criminal empire. From underground casinos to illegal betting operations, he established networks that were profitable, discreet, and professionally managed. Managers and enforcers were carefully selected, and revenue flows were monitored and controlled. Luciano's approach to gambling mirrored his broader philosophy. Violence was a tool, not a constant, and efficiency was paramount. By creating predictable, well-organized gambling operations, he reduced the chaos and unpredictability that had historically plagued the underworld, allowing for steady revenue generation and minimal disruption to his broader network. Labor racketeering represented a subtler, yet equally powerful element of Luciano's business acumen. By infiltrating unions, controlling strikes, and manipulating contracts, he extracted wealth and influence from legitimate industries without necessarily resorting to public violence. These operations required strategic negotiation, legal maneuvering, and psychological insight, as they involved interactions with workers, union leaders, and employers. Luciano's ability to integrate coercion, persuasion, and strategic alliance building allowed him to dominate these sectors, further reinforcing the perception that his network was both omnipresent and inescapably powerful. Prostitution and vice operations were also meticulously managed. Rather than relying on disorganized street-level control, Luciano implemented systems that ensured both profitability and control. Managers were held accountable, protection arrangements were enforced, and revenue was tracked with precision. These operations were both lucrative and strategically valuable, providing financial stability while reinforcing loyalty and dependence among subordinates. By applying organizational principles to vice, Luciano transformed a chaotic and often dangerous sector into a predictable and manageable source of power. Central to all of these ventures was Luciano's ability to coordinate and delegate. He recognized that trying to control every detail personally was neither feasible nor efficient. Trusted lieutenants were placed in charge of specific operations, responsible for reporting results, maintaining discipline, and ensuring compliance with organizational rules. This delegation allowed Luciano to maintain influence over a vast network without being consumed by minutiae, while also empowering subordinates and fostering loyalty. By creating a structure in which authority and responsibility were distributed, he strengthened the resilience and adaptability of his criminal empire. The integration of intelligence and surveillance further distinguished Luciano's business operations. He maintained networks of informants, strategically placed agents, and covert observation methods that provided real-time information on rival activities, law enforcement actions, and internal compliance. This intelligence allowed him to anticipate threats, preempt challenges, and adjust operations proactively. The ability to act with foresight rather than reaction enabled Luciano to maintain stability, optimize profits, and minimize disruption, reinforcing both his authority and the perception of invincibility that surrounded his network. Financial management was equally critical. Luciano instituted systems to ensure that profits were tracked, disputes over money were minimized, and resources were allocated efficiently. Transparency within the network was limited, but accountability among lieutenants was enforced rigorously. This approach not only maximized profit but also reinforced loyalty, as individuals understood that their performance and reliability directly affected both their personal gain and the stability of the organization. In essence, Luciano ran his criminal enterprises like a corporation, with a focus on efficiency, accountability, and long-term sustainability. Psychologically, Luciano's approach to business reinforced his authority and influence. Subordinates and rivals alike perceived him as a master strategist capable of seeing patterns and opportunities that others could not. This perception amplified loyalty, as individuals were motivated to align themselves with a leader who appeared not only powerful but also intelligent and prescient. Fear, respect, and admiration became intertwined, reinforcing the cohesion and stability of his network. Those who challenged him did so at great risk, while those who collaborated benefited from inclusion in a disciplined and profitable system. Another defining characteristic of Luciano's business acumen was his capacity for innovation. He continuously sought ways to expand revenue streams, optimize operations, and reduce risk. Whether through cross-ethnic alliances, the creation of the Commission to mediate disputes, or strategic negotiation with political and law enforcement figures, Luciano leveraged every tool at his disposal to enhance profitability and security. This forward-thinking approach ensured that his criminal enterprise remained adaptable, resilient, and dominant in an environment that was constantly changing. The coordination of multiple enterprises also created synergy. Profits from one venture could support expansion in another, and influence in one sector could be leveraged in negotiations elsewhere. Luciano understood that power and wealth were not isolated phenomena but interdependent elements of a broader strategic system. By linking operations, authority, and influence, he created a self-reinforcing network that magnified his control and ensured long-term sustainability. The business of crime under Luciano was no longer a series of disconnected schemes, it was an integrated, adaptive, and highly profitable ecosystem. By the late 1930s, Luciano's criminal operations had reached a level of sophistication unmatched in history. His combination of strategic foresight, operational discipline, psychological mastery, and financial acumen allowed him to dominate every major illegal enterprise in New York and influence operations nationally. Violence was minimized, efficiency maximized, and loyalty carefully cultivated. The business of crime had been transformed into a professional, predictable, and extraordinarily profitable enterprise, reflecting Luciano's vision, intelligence, and ruthlessness. In essence, Luciano's empire demonstrated that organized crime could be approached as a complex system, requiring strategic planning, psychological insight, operational discipline, and financial management. His innovation set a precedent that would shape criminal enterprises for decades, demonstrating that intelligence and structure could achieve far more than brute force alone. Through meticulous planning, coordination, and psychological mastery, Luciano had not only built wealth and influence but had redefined what it meant to operate successfully within the underworld. By the mid-1930s, Luciano had firmly established himself as a central figure in New York's underworld, but with great power came equally great threats. The web of alliances and rivalries that had facilitated his rise now demanded constant attention, for every ally had the potential to become a rival, and every rival could be a deadly adversary. In this volatile environment, the line between friend and foe was never static. Luciano's genius lay in his ability to navigate these shifting dynamics, balancing loyalty, influence, and intimidation to maintain dominance while neutralizing threats before they could destabilize his empire. Alliances were the foundation of Luciano's strategy, but they were rarely permanent. Strategic partnerships were forged not out of personal affection but out of mutual interest and opportunity. Jewish mobsters, Irish gang leaders, and Italian factions were brought together under his coordination, often cooperating on profitable ventures such as bootlegging, gambling, and labor rackets. Luciano understood that cross-cultural alliances increased operational reach and diversified influence, but they also required careful management. Cultural differences, personal grudges, and competing ambitions created constant friction, demanding diplomacy, negotiation, and occasional displays of force to ensure compliance and harmony. One of the most significant alliances in Luciano's career was with Meyer Lansky, the Jewish crime strategist whose intellect and financial acumen complemented Luciano's organizational vision. Lansky was not only a valuable operational partner but also a psychological sounding board, helping Luciano refine strategy and manage complex networks of influence. Together, they coordinated national bootlegging operations, integrated gambling enterprises, and created a system in which the network's profits and power were maximized. This alliance was emblematic of Luciano's broader philosophy. Effective partnerships were based on mutual respect, complementary skills, and shared interest, rather than personal loyalty alone. At the same time, Luciano faced relentless threats from traditionalist Italian gangsters, who resented his modernizing influence and his willingness to cooperate with non-Italian factions. Figures like Vito Genovese and Frank Costello presented both opportunities and challenges. Luciano had to balance accommodation with assertion, negotiating their cooperation while subtly ensuring that ultimate authority remained with him. These relationships were delicate, requiring psychological insight, strategic patience, and the occasional calculated use of violence. A misstep could spark rebellion, while a miscalculation in alliance management could threaten the stability of the entire organization. Rivalries extended beyond ethnic or cultural lines. Ambitious gangsters within Luciano's network constantly tested boundaries, probing for weaknesses, seeking to exploit grievances, or attempting to claim authority for themselves. These internal threats required constant vigilance. Luciano monitored his lieutenants, assessed behavior for signs of disloyalty, and reinforced organizational norms through both reward and punishment. By maintaining this psychological and operational oversight, he could detect potential betrayal before it escalated into open conflict. The perception that Luciano was both omniscient and decisive was as powerful a deterrent as the actual enforcement of rules. Luciano's management of allies and enemies also involved strategic deception. He understood that information could be manipulated to influence perception, mislead rivals, and create opportunities. By controlling the flow of intelligence, he could engineer conflicts between others, redirect attention from his own operations, and consolidate power without exposing himself to unnecessary risk. This ability to manipulate perception was a critical psychological tool, allowing him to maintain influence and control in an environment where uncertainty and mistrust were constant. Personal charisma was another vital component. Luciano's reputation for intelligence, decisiveness, and measured ruthlessness inspired loyalty and intimidated rivals. He projected confidence and competence, creating an aura of inevitability that dissuaded potential challengers. Allies were motivated to align themselves with him, recognizing that collaboration offered both protection and opportunity. Even adversaries understood that opposing Luciano required careful calculation and carried significant risk. In this way, his personal presence amplified organizational authority, reinforcing both loyalty and fear as complementary instruments of control. However, the interplay between alliance and enmity was not static. It was fluid, requiring continuous attention. Political connections, law enforcement relationships, and economic leverage were all instruments in the management of power dynamics. Luciano skillfully navigated these external pressures, using influence, bribery, and negotiation to protect allies, neutralize rivals, and maintain the operational integrity of his network. By integrating external forces into his strategy, he ensured that enemies had limited options for disruption and allies had tangible incentives for continued cooperation. Betrayal remained a constant threat. Even close partners could be swayed by personal ambition or external pressure. Luciano mitigated this risk through a combination of surveillance, psychological insight, and strategic enforcement. He maintained networks of informants and loyal lieutenants who reported on behavior, ensuring that any signs of disloyalty were identified early. When betrayal did occur, consequences were swift and decisive, reinforcing the perception that the cost of treachery outweighed any potential gain. In this way, the dual forces of fear and respect were continually calibrated to maintain organizational cohesion. Luciano also recognized the importance of reputation beyond immediate alliances. His credibility with both allies and rivals shaped the behavior of others, often before direct interaction occurred. By cultivating an image of intelligence, strategic vision, and ruthlessness, he created a psychological framework in which allies sought alignment and enemies hesitated to challenge him. Reputation became a tool as powerful as any weapon, influencing decisions, guiding alliances, and shaping the balance of power. The most significant turning points in this period were marked by decisive actions against rivals who threatened his authority. Carefully orchestrated hits, strategic displacements, and negotiated eliminations of key adversaries ensured that Luciano's dominance remained uncontested. Each action served multiple purposes: removing immediate threats, sending a message to others, and reinforcing the perception of strategic omnipotence. By managing enemies with a combination of precision and psychological insight, he ensured that the balance of power consistently favored him, reinforcing both his authority and the stability of the network. At the same time, Luciano's management of allies created opportunities for expansion. Trusted partners were empowered to develop new ventures, coordinate cross-ethnic collaborations, and oversee complex operations. These empowered lieutenants were rewarded with profit, authority, and protection, creating a self-reinforcing system of loyalty and operational efficiency. By aligning personal ambition with organizational success, Luciano minimized internal friction while maximizing productivity, allowing the network to grow and consolidate influence across the city and beyond. Through this intricate balance of alliances and rivalries, Luciano demonstrated a mastery of human dynamics rarely seen in the criminal world. He understood that power was not a static asset but a continuously negotiated phenomenon, shaped by relationships, perception, and opportunity. By managing both allies and enemies with psychological acuity, strategic foresight, and calculated enforcement, he maintained dominance in a highly volatile and dangerous environment. By the late 1930s, Luciano's skillful orchestration of relationships had solidified his position as the central figure in New York's underworld. Allies were loyal because it was in their interest, rivals were cautious because of his reputation, and the network as a whole operated with unprecedented coordination and stability. His ability to manage human behavior, balance competing interests, and leverage both fear and respect allowed him to maintain power without constant conflict, demonstrating a level of strategic sophistication that transcended brute force. In sum, the interplay between allies and enemies under Luciano was a psychological, strategic, and operational masterpiece. It required continuous attention, precise calculation, and a deep understanding of human nature. By integrating diplomacy, coercion, perception management, and decisive enforcement, he maintained dominance over a complex and often volatile network. His success in this realm not only reinforced his authority but also established a model of leadership and organizational control that would define the Mafia for generations to come. By the late 1930s, Luciano's empire had reached a level of sophistication and influence that few in the underworld could rival. Yet beneath the surface of apparent stability, a hidden war was raging. A constant battle for power, control, and survival that was invisible to the casual observer. This conflict was not always waged in the streets with guns and blood. Much of it was psychological, strategic, and carefully orchestrated. Luciano had learned that the most effective battles were often fought behind the scenes, where manipulation, intelligence, and influence could achieve what brute force alone could not. The hidden war encompassed multiple layers. Internally, Luciano had to manage the ambitions, jealousies, and grievances of his own lieutenants. Men like Genovese, Costello, and Anastasia were powerful figures with personal agendas and the capacity for insubordination. Each had to be carefully monitored, guided, and occasionally restrained. Luciano relied on a combination of rewards, subtle intimidation, and delegation to maintain control. He understood that internal strife could be as dangerous as external threats, and he devoted enormous attention to preemptively resolving potential conflicts before they erupted into violence. Externally, rival gangs continued to challenge his authority, seeking to carve out territory or exploit weaknesses in his network. These challenges required both tactical and strategic responses. Luciano could not simply crush every competitor through force. Doing so would provoke retaliation, draw unwanted law enforcement attention, and destabilize the network. Instead, he deployed a mix of negotiation, strategic alliances, and carefully calculated hits to neutralize threats. Every action was measured, designed not only to eliminate a rival but also to send a message to the broader criminal community. Luciano's dominance was unassailable, his reach inescapable. Law enforcement presented another front in the hidden war. Though corruption and bribery allowed Luciano a measure of protection, the authorities were never entirely under his control. Surveillance, informants, and investigations threatened to expose operations, disrupt revenue streams, and endanger key figures. Luciano understood that success required a nuanced approach: maintain influence with friendly officials, misdirect investigators, and compartmentalize operations to minimize vulnerability. He developed sophisticated strategies for dealing with legal pressure, blending negotiation, intimidation, and selective compliance to protect his empire while projecting an image of invulnerability. The hidden war was also psychological. Luciano recognized that perception could be as powerful as action. Rivals had to believe that opposing him was futile, allies had to feel both loyalty and fear, and subordinates had to understand the consequences of failure or betrayal. This was achieved through subtle displays of power, strategic communication, and calculated manipulation. Rumors were leveraged, loyalties tested, and potential threats neutralized before they fully materialized. By controlling perception, Luciano maintained an advantage in conflicts that might otherwise have escalated into open violence. A critical aspect of this war was the constant negotiation of power balances. Luciano's network was vast and diverse, encompassing multiple ethnic groups, criminal enterprises, and geographic territories. Conflicts were inevitable, but he mitigated them by creating systems of mediation, arbitration, and mutual benefit. The Commission played a central role, allowing disputes to be resolved without undermining overall stability. By institutionalizing these mechanisms, Luciano minimized the destructive potential of competition, transforming conflict into a tool for reinforcing hierarchy and authority rather than destabilizing it. At the same time, Luciano's hidden war required vigilance against betrayal from within. Even the most trusted allies could be tempted by ambition, greed, or external pressure. Luciano employed an extensive network of informants, loyal lieutenants, and surveillance measures to detect early signs of disloyalty. When breaches occurred, responses were swift and decisive. Punishments were carefully calibrated to eliminate threats while reinforcing the perception of omnipotence. Through these actions, he maintained a delicate balance. Allies were motivated to remain loyal, rivals were deterred from challenging him, and the organization functioned with both fear and respect as guiding principles. International factors also influenced this hidden war. Luciano understood that organized crime was not limited to local operations. It was part of a global network of trade, smuggling, and influence. Alliances with figures in Cuba, Canada, and across the United States provided opportunities but also introduced complexity and risk. Managing these relationships required diplomacy, trust, and strategic oversight. Luciano's ability to integrate international operations into his network enhanced both profitability and resilience, allowing him to leverage resources and influence far beyond the streets of New York. Economic fluctuations and shifting political landscapes added another layer to the conflict. The end of prohibition, changing labor laws, and increased public scrutiny forced Luciano to adapt rapidly. Flexibility was essential. Operations had to be modified, alliances renegotiated, and revenue streams diversified. Failure to respond to these pressures could destabilize the network and invite challenges. Luciano's genius lay in his ability to anticipate change, plan contingencies, and act decisively, often before rivals fully understood the evolving environment. His hidden war was as much about adaptation and foresight as it was about direct confrontation. Violence, while a visible aspect of conflict, was always carefully managed. Luciano reserved it for strategic moments, using it to enforce discipline, eliminate critical threats, or send a symbolic message. Unnecessary bloodshed was avoided, both to maintain operational stability and to minimize law enforcement attention. Each violent act was integrated into a broader strategy, serving multiple objectives simultaneously. This disciplined approach distinguished Luciano from many of his contemporaries, who relied on brute force alone and often destabilized their own networks in the process. Ultimately, the hidden war under Luciano was a battle for control over a complex, multifaceted empire. It demanded psychological insight, operational discipline, strategic foresight, and relentless attention to detail. Every ally had to be managed, every rival monitored, and every threat anticipated. The war was ongoing, invisible to outsiders but decisive in maintaining the cohesion, profitability, and dominance of the network. Luciano's ability to wage this war effectively ensured that his empire remained unchallenged, resilient, and adaptive. By the end of this period, Luciano had demonstrated that true power was not solely about public displays of dominance but about mastery over the unseen forces that shape human behavior, relationships, and opportunity. The Hidden War was a crucible in which his leadership, intelligence, and psychological insight were continuously tested. Through careful orchestration, he maintained the balance of fear and loyalty, managed rivalries, and leveraged both internal and external pressures to reinforce his authority. The underworld operated not as a chaotic battlefield, but as a disciplined network functioning under his strategic vision. In essence, Luciano's Hidden War was the foundation of his enduring power. It was fought not just with guns and money but with intelligence, perception, and psychological mastery. By managing internal conflicts, neutralizing rivals, navigating law enforcement pressures, and integrating international operations, he ensured that his empire remained stable, profitable, and dominant. The visible success of his criminal enterprise was only the surface. Beneath it lay a complex, ongoing struggle that demonstrated the depth of Luciano's strategic genius and the breadth of his control over the American underworld. Even the most powerful empires face vulnerability, and for Luciano the cracks began in the late 1930s. Decades of careful orchestration could not fully shield him from legal scrutiny, shifting political pressures, and the ambitions of rivals. The arrest in 1936 on charges of compulsory prostitution marked the first visible fracture in his empire. This was more than a legal challenge, it was a psychological blow. Subordinates questioned their loyalties, rivals sensed opportunity, and the perception of invincibility that Luciano had cultivated began to waver. The arrest revealed the limitations of influence. Informants and coerced witnesses eroded the protective shield of omerta, and political allies could no longer guarantee immunity. Even small betrayals or lapses in communication created instability, threatening the cohesion of the network he had built. Luciano relied on trusted lieutenants to maintain operations, but without his direct oversight, the empire faced unprecedented vulnerability. Media sensationalism amplified the fall, turning the trial into a public spectacle and eroding both fear and loyalty among associates. The delicate balance of loyalty, authority, and perception, which had sustained him for years, was now under pressure. The fall had begun, not with a single catastrophic event, but as a gradual unraveling caused by legal pressure, betrayal, and the erosion of institutional protection. Luciano's genius would be tested as never before, forcing him to adapt and confront the reality that even an empire built on intelligence, strategy, and fear could be shaken by forces beyond control. The courtroom became a stage where Luciano's empire faced its most public challenge. The trial was not just legal but psychological, a contest of perception, loyalty, and authority. The prosecution, armed with testimonies from coerced witnesses and former associates, sought to portray him as a manipulative and omnipotent criminal mastermind. Each statement chipped away at the aura of invincibility he had cultivated for decades. Media coverage amplified the drama, turning Luciano into a symbol of organized crime for the public. The narrative of fear and admiration collided with the law, and the courtroom became both battleground and spectacle. Luciano's defense relied on calm composure, coded communication with allies, and strategic manipulation of perception, but even his brilliance could not fully counter the legal and psychological weight of the proceedings. The sentence, decades behind bars, was a formal acknowledgement of defeat. It disrupted his direct control over operations and forced subordinates and rivals alike to reassess their positions. Yet even in confinement, Luciano's influence endured through loyal lieutenants and a disciplined network, proving that his empire was resilient. The trial and sentence marked a turning point. The rise of a near-mythical figure had collided with law, media, and morality, reshaping both public perception and the operational dynamics of organized crime. Even behind the walls of prison, Luciano's power did not vanish. For most men, incarceration represents the ultimate loss of autonomy, stripping individuals of control over their environment, their operations, and even their reputation. For Luciano, however, imprisonment became a new battlefield, an arena where intelligence, psychological mastery, and strategic foresight could be tested in ways that few could imagine. The empire he had built for decades was not dependent solely on his physical presence. It relied on the loyalty of subordinates, the discipline of organizational systems, and the perception of his unshakable authority. Prison would prove that these pillars were strong enough to sustain him even when separated from the streets he once ruled. From the moment he was locked behind bars, Luciano's first priority was the continuity of his criminal network. He quickly established a system of intermediaries and lieutenants, men he trusted implicitly to carry out his directives without hesitation or deviation. Orders were transmitted with precision, through coded messages, trusted envoys, and carefully managed communication channels. ensuring that the machinery of his empire remained operational. Every detail, from the allocation of resources to strategic decisions regarding rivals and allies, was monitored indirectly, and Luciano proved adept at orchestrating complex operations from afar. Perception became a powerful tool in this confined environment. Subordinates were constantly reminded, through subtle gestures, information leaks, and strategic enforcement, that Luciano's authority remained intact. Allies continued to demonstrate loyalty not out of fear alone, but also from the recognition that alignment with Luciano guaranteed protection and opportunity. Rivals, meanwhile, understood that despite his imprisonment, any attempt to exploit his absence would be met with swift consequences. The psychological projection of power, as much as its operational execution, ensured the cohesion of the network. The prison itself became a stage for Luciano's psychological and strategic influence. He studied guards, fellow inmates, and administrators, learning to navigate the bureaucracy and leverage interpersonal relationships to his advantage. Through careful observation, he identified weaknesses, cultivated informal alliances, and ensured that his presence was felt even in spaces designed to constrain him. Power, he demonstrated, was not bound by walls. It was a function of foresight, adaptability, and the disciplined management of people. Communication networks were critical. Through a system of loyal intermediaries and intelligence channels, Luciano remained informed about rival movements, operational challenges, and emerging opportunities. He was able to direct activities, resolve disputes, and enforce discipline, ensuring that his absence did not result in chaos. This level of control was unprecedented for a man confined in prison and illustrated the sophistication of the organizational systems he had meticulously built over decades. Luciano's influence extended beyond internal operations. Political connections, judicial contacts, and allies outside the prison allowed him to shape decisions that impacted his organization, negotiate favorable outcomes, and protect key associates. Bribery, persuasion, and psychological leverage ensured that even legal and institutional forces could be manipulated to maintain the empire's stability. Imprisonment, rather than diminishing his power, became an opportunity to prove that true influence relies on strategy and perception as much as on physical freedom. The psychological impact of his continued authority was profound. Subordinates understood that loyalty remained essential, rivals were deterred from challenging him, and the operational network continued to function efficiently. The perception that Luciano was omnipresent, even when physically absent, reinforced obedience and minimized internal strife. His empire demonstrated resilience under pressure, illustrating that a well-constructed network could survive external shocks and internal uncertainty. By the end of this period, Luciano's ability to maintain control behind bars had become a defining aspect of his legacy. Prison, a tool designed to curtail power, had become a stage for demonstrating psychological acuity, strategic mastery, and organizational resilience. Power behind bars was not merely survival, it was the exercise of influence, perception, and control in a new and challenging environment. His empire, constrained but far from broken, continued to operate with discipline, efficiency, and cohesion, a testament to the foresight, intelligence, and enduring authority of the man who had built it.